talk about, as promised, was boundaries and enforcing boundaries and what it means to enforce boundaries, why we don't enforce boundaries, and also that really important distinction between, am I enforcing a boundary or am I just being an asshole? And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, because especially if you are, I want to say a woman, because most of us do fall into that category of being a people pleaser or somebody who is a yes person. We struggle with the feeling of powerfully, confidently enforcing boundaries. Now, I am going to hold my hand up and say that I still struggle with this. I have not perfected this. I am not an expert at this by any stretch of the imagination. I still struggle with this on a daily basis, and it's because I still battle with being a yes person. I still battle with being a people pleaser. I am an empath. I am somebody who's still, there's a lot of trauma from my past that I still work on every single day. And so that's one of the reasons why, I'll hold my hand up and say boundaries are still something I'm working on, so you can know all the reasons behind why boundaries are so important, and you can know the reasons why XYZ needs to be done. That doesn't mean implementing it is going to be any easier. It's literally something that is a daily battle, a daily challenge, a daily process. So if this is something that you are still struggling with, please give yourself some grace. And please be kind to yourself. Be kind to yourself. This is not something we are all, that we just, you know what, I need to do this, and we suddenly do it. We're all works in progress, so let's keep that in mind as we go through this. So I want to start with, the importance of boundaries. Why is it important for us to set boundaries? I talked about this in my blog post, but in a nutshell, we distill it down to A, it helps us navigate our relationships a little bit better. And B, they help to determine your scope of responsibility. So what are you responsible for versus what are you not responsible for? I think the most important thing in that area is your emotions versus the emotions of other people. Particularly if you are a caring, empathic person, that can sometimes be really difficult to differentiate. Whose emotions are whose, right? But that is one of the things that boundaries really helps you with. Now, boundaries are influenced by a lot of things: our values, our experiences, our personal traumas, culture, family, expectation, right? They are influenced by a lot of things. The great thing about them is that they're flexible, right? They don't have to be rigid. And by flexible, I don't mean that you allow people to decide where that boundary starts and ends. No, I mean that you are allowed to decide whether you want to change a boundary. You are allowed to decide whether you want it to be flexible here, there, anywhere. It's like I posted yesterday, your boundaries are not a democracy, right? Nobody gets to decide what your boundaries are in a committee. They're up to you. So when I say they're flexible, be very clear that I'm saying you get to decide whether they're flexible or not somebody else because they're uncomfortable with it. Okay? Now, when we don't enforce boundaries, when I acknowledged this, it was really hard. It was really, really hard. So what I'm about to say may not sit well with some of you, but that's okay. Allow it to sit with you before you decide whether you're okay with it. We don't enforce boundaries because we prioritize our need to be liked over any cost to our integrity and to our principles. Ouch. Right? It's true though. So we don't enforce boundaries because we prioritize our perception of what other people need and what we're able to give them. And also because we prioritize others' perceptions of us over everything else. So we're worried about our relationship with other people, how they're going to view us, how they're going to see us. And that is something that I think is really common for a lot of us who have traditionally held that role of the fixer, the people pleaser, the glue in the family, the friend that smooths everything over. We are that person. But here's the thing, when we do finally decide it's time to set a boundary and we set the boundary, we can either be really wishy-washy with our boundaries or we can go the other extreme to the other end and be really, really rigid with our boundaries. Almost defensive with our boundaries. And that's when the line gets blurred as to whether we're actually just enforcing our boundaries with with strength or whether we're just being a jerk. What that comes down to is responsibility, that scope of responsibility. Sometimes refusing to do something that is your responsibility is actually unreasonable. And so how do we tell the difference? Who are you responsible for and who are you responsible to? I think that's the first place to start that particular conversation. So personally, are you being asked to do something or endure something, that is something you otherwise wouldn't do? Okay, so that's an example of a personal boundary question that you can ask yourself. In a work context, that might look like, are you being given responsibilities that are outside your scope of responsibility, like outside of your work description or your job description or your role, or the agreed duties and responsibilities that you would be undertaking. Now, I am all for being a team player and, getting in there and doing things and showing your value in that way. But I'm also guilty of taking that to the extreme where it actually encroaches on my time and my values and my integrity. Then it becomes an expectation that Sarah's going to go above and beyond, and it doesn't become a value add anymore. Do you know what I mean? Let me know if you can relate to that, because I think that's pretty common for a lot of people, particularly in the workplace. Especially in a workplace where you're constantly in fear of losing your job, you always try to go above and beyond because you want to be seen as valuable, right? Let me give you first a couple of examples of areas or examples where boundaries are being crossed, where they're being broken, and whether you have a responsibility to kind of stand up for yourself or not. So one of the more common examples is the leeway that we give not only to our friends, but family members, colleagues. And this is when we let our friends, for example, run roughshod over our feelings and our emotions. So when we give leeway to our friends, sometimes letting them run over our emotions and our feelings, and this can, manifest itself in ways like where they tell jokes about you, or they embarrass you. And it can be verbal, it can be jokes, it can be teasing, it can be backhanded compliments, it can be put downs or insults, and the quote unquote joke. Physically, what does this look like? And some of you can probably relate to this. I know that, for example, when I was in university, this was a huge challenge for me because I had a lot of male friends, unwanted groping or touching or even putting a hand on your shoulder or taking your things, right? Taking your things is also crossing your boundaries without asking, without permission. And sometimes you feel like you can't speak up because, it's just a joke. Stop being so sensitive. Oh, don't be so sensitive. They didn't mean it. Don't take it so seriously. They were just joking around. This is what they do. This is how they are. And that makes us then feel like we're being unreasonable, right? In expecting people to treat us a particular way. Well, they do that with everyone, So maybe I'm just being overly sensitive or unreasonable. It's not uncommon. But this is an example of where your boundaries, enforcing your boundaries, is justified. And it's actually necessary because you don't have a responsibility, and this is that word again, responsibility. You don't have a responsibility to let people hurt you or insult you or make you feel uncomfortable. And my blog post this week was about when people push back on boundaries. And when people push back on boundaries, it's usually because you're calling them out on a behavior. Right? You're calling them out on a behavior that they've either not been called out on before. You're making them reflect on what they do and how they behave. And that is the number one reason why people push back on boundaries that you enforce, because you are making them see something about themselves that is not so nice. My second example was when you're being asked to handle responsibilities that actually belong to someone else. Right? So, and this is, again, another one that's like a relationship one. So you can insert partner, you can insert friend, or you can insert family member in here. But an example is when they expect you to manage their mood. It's up to you to make sure that they don't get lonely or bored or jealous. Maybe they need your constant input or constant presence, or you're being pressured to let things slide that you normally wouldn't accept, right? At work, it's doing other people's work for them. It's allowing other people to take credit for your work. Or what's worse, and this happened, oh my God, this happened a lot in my last position. People taking credit for work that you're doing while they're just slacking off. Pain in the ass. Jenny says, I see that happening with baby boomers whose old-fashioned ideas of keeping the peace and just being quiet. Yes! Yes! And it's not just baby boomers. There's a lot of us in the Gen X generation as well who were, sorry, I'm wobbling around, who were brought up with those baby boomer values, and we're told that, just keep the peace, don't rock the boat, be quiet. So going back to the work example, this also comes into play when you're maybe covering for someone else's mistakes, right? Especially when you didn't even have a hand in them being made. And that's happened in the workplace too. Somebody screws up, hey, can you do me a favor? It's that quid pro quo type thing, right? And that's not cool. Now, these are all examples. All of them are examples of when you should absolutely be enforcing your boundaries. So where's the line? If you're neglecting your partner, you don't take their feelings into consideration, you go off and do your own thing, then yeah, that's not enforcing a boundary, that's kind of being a jerk. Or you're blaming other people for things that are within the realm of your responsibility, that's not enforcing boundaries, that's being a jerk. Refusing to compromise in areas within your control, or refusing to participate in something where you equally share responsibility, and parenting is a wonderful example of this. As parents, you are equally responsible for your children. But if you place more of that responsibility on somebody else, and again, we see this happening a lot because, moms, right? That's not enforcing boundaries, that's being a jerk. But I'm going to say I've also seen this go the other way, right? I've seen moms do the same thing with dads, with grandparents. That is not enforcing a boundary. So the really clear distinction here is what is your responsibility and what is not. Because that is how you can differentiate, whether you're enforcing a healthy boundary, whether this is a boundary that you should even have in place, or whether maybe you need to reconsider your behavior. Now, it all comes down to being clear on what your responsibilities are. So here they are. You are your responsibility. Your emotions are your responsibility. Your expectations of others are your responsibility. Are your expectations reasonable? Because remember, they have needs and wants and responsibilities too. Your needs are your responsibility. Do not expect other people to fulfill your needs, particularly if you've never communicated them. Right? And I see this a lot too. People who are really uncomfortable enforcing boundaries sometimes never communicate them. So if you go back to read the blog post that I wrote a couple weeks ago, that's one of the things I talk about. Just because you've set a boundary doesn't suddenly make it real. You have to communicate it. You have to tell people, this is what I'm doing. Now, your values and your priorities are also your responsibility. You have to clearly define what is important to you, what you're willing to stand up for, and what you're willing to, let slide. And what are your priorities? We make visible what we value. That's something that is very important to me, and that I've learned about in the last little while, and that I've really had to come to terms with. You make visible what you value. I'm going to talk about that another day. I'm not going to go into that, but I want you to think about what that means for you. When you're clear on your responsibilities, your emotions, your values, your priorities, your expectations, and your needs, I think I said needs, then it becomes easier to enforce healthy boundaries, because then you know exactly what you need to be responsible for and what is not in your responsibility. But the last thing I want to leave you with, the most important thing I think, is really understanding when you are setting a boundary, when you are enforcing a boundary, and when you are communicating that boundary, be very clear. How does this boundary help me? What is it allowing me to do? Is it peace of mind? Is it allowing me to put containers around my time? Is it allowing me to spend better time with my kids? Is it allowing me to be more present? Is it allowing me to do my work better? What is that boundary allowing you to do? And how does it improve my relationship with X person? That's a really critical piece, and I think a lot of us don't really take the time to consider that. When we set boundaries and when we want to enforce boundaries, we enforce them from our own personal perspective, which, I get it. That's the only perspective you have. But you have to be able, if you want people to get on side and you want people to respect your boundaries, then you have to also understand, how does this boundary improve my relationship with XYZ person? If I'm setting a boundary, I need 30 minutes of peace at the end of the workday to unload and to just unwind and to decompress. So I might say to my husband, you need to take the kids for 30 minutes or I'm going to, break something because I need that time for myself. That's fine. I've communicated the need. I need that time to decompress. But what makes it easier for my husband now to help enforce my boundary is me saying it's going to allow me to show up better, more present and calmer for you and the kids if I can have 30 minutes of peace to myself. So it really is, it's that two-pronged approach. Why is this important to me? But how is it also going to help improve my relationship with the person with whom I'm enforcing that boundary? Let me know in the comments if you have any follow-on questions or if I said something that either didn't sit well, didn't stick, or you need more clarification on. I'm happy to provide it. We're all works in progress, and it's a daily activity. I'm not even going to call it a challenge. It's just a daily activity, right? Showing up and saying, this is how I would like to be treated. You got to renew that vow with yourself every day. I love you. Have a wonderful day.